The moment Jasper Trask stepped into the Caldwell cattle market on that blazing Tuesday in September of 1882, every man within 50 feet either straightened his spine or stepped back, and sometimes both at the same time. He was not the tallest man in the yard, though he was close. He was not the loudest, and that was perhaps the most unnerving thing about him. He moved through the press of cattle drivers and ranchers and merchants with a kind of deliberate, unhurried authority that made the crowd part like water around a stone dropped into a still creek. His boots were worn but clean, his dark hat pulled low against the hammering Kansas sun, and his jaw carried 3 days of black stubble that somehow looked less like neglect and more like intention. He had built his reputation one cattle deal at a time over 15 years, and somewhere along the way, his name had become the kind of name that preceded him into a room before his body did. Jasper Trask of the Double T Ranch. The man who had once outbid the Rocking Chair Cattle Company for an entire herd of 500 longhorns and paid in full, in cash, before noon. The man who had put 2 buyers on the ground in separate disputes over fair pricing, neither of them requiring a weapon, only his hands and a particular quality of stillness that most men found more threatening than a drawn revolver. The man who had tripled the acreage of the Double T in 6 years, through nothing more complicated than relentless work and an almost violent refusal to accept bad terms from anyone. Men stepped aside for Jasper Trask. They had done it for years, and they would likely go on doing it for years more. It was simply the natural order of the Caldwell market, the way the river bent around the mill, the way younger hands deferred to older ones. Nobody questioned it, and nobody resented it out loud, at least not where he could hear them. And then, on that particular Tuesday in September, while the sun was still climbing toward its peak, and the smell of livestock and sawdust and fresh-turned earth was hanging thick over everything, Evelyn Harper walked through the main gate of the cattle market, and Jasper Trask stepped aside for her before he had fully processed the decision to do it. He noticed that himself, a half-second after it happened, and the noticing surprised him in a way that very little had surprised him in a long while. She had come through the gate with purpose, that much was plain. She was not drifting, not browsing, not the kind of woman who wandered into a cattle market on a whim. She carried a leather satchel over one shoulder and a folded sheaf of papers in her left hand, and her dark auburn hair was pinned up beneath a practical felt hat that had clearly seen weather. Her dress was a deep brown that the sun had faded slightly at the shoulders, and her boots, he noted, were proper riding boots, not the delicate town shoes that some of the merchants' wives wore when they came to watch their husbands work. She looked like a woman who had ridden to get here, and she had, he would later learn, ridden 11 miles from a homestead that sat just beyond the eastern tree line. She was 26 years old, though Jasper did not know that yet. He was 34, which was a gap that felt reasonable to him in an abstract way when he thought about it later, though he was not thinking about gaps or ages in that first moment. He was thinking, with some degree of bewilderment, about the fact that he had moved for her without meaning to. She noticed that. He could see it in the slight change of her expression as she passed, the way her brown eyes flicked to him with something that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, but something in between. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of an unexpected courtesy in a place that did not deal much in courtesies. She did not slow down. She kept walking, those papers clutched in her hand, her jaw set with a determination that reminded him, oddly, of the way a good cutting horse looks just before it commits to the turn. Jasper Trask stood where he had stepped to and watched her cross the market yard, and then he turned back to the pen of Hereford cattle he had been inspecting, and he told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. He crossed paths with her twice more in the next hour. The first time was at the water trough near the east fence, where she was attempting to get the attention of a heavy-set broker named Conrad Deli, who was in the middle of what he clearly considered a very important conversation with two other men, and who had, in the manner of men who consider women an interruption in business settings, simply not turned around when she spoke his name. Jasper was passing at a distance of about 10 feet. He did not slow down immediately, but something in her posture, the way her shoulders had gone very still with a restrained frustration she was not allowing to reach her face, made him stop. "Deli," he said. Conrad Deli turned around immediately. Jasper did not say anything else. He just looked at Deli, and then he looked at Evelyn, and then he walked on. He heard over the noise of the market Deli saying, "Miss, what can I do for you?" And that was enough. The second time was at the livestock registration desk, where a dispute had apparently broken out over a bill of sale. Evelyn was standing at the counter, her papers spread out before her, her voice low and precise, and absolutely not backing down from the clerk who was trying to tell her that the registration could not be processed because the name on the deed was not her name. "The name on the deed is Robert Harper," she was saying when Jasper drifted into earshot. "Robert Harper was my father. He died in April. I am his heir and the sole inheritor of the Harper homestead and all associated livestock, which is documented in this probate filing from the Sumner County Courthouse, which I have here in my hand." The clerk, a young man with ink on his fingers and a general air of someone who had never been required to think too hard about anything, looked at the probate filing with the expression of a man who has been handed a document in a foreign language. "I'll need to speak to Mr. Alcott about this," he said. "You have been speaking to Mr. Alcott for 40 minutes, Evelyn said. "Or rather, you have been saying you need to speak to Mr. Alcott for 40 minutes, which is not the same thing." Jasper stepped up to the counter beside her, not in front of her, beside her. The clerk looked at him with visible relief, the way people look at the arrival of someone they expect to take control of a situation that has confused them. "Mr. Trask," the clerk said. "The lady has a valid probate filing," Jasper said. He glanced at the papers on the counter for a moment. "Sumner County Courthouse stamp looks right. What's the difficulty?" "Well, the deed is in a man's name. The deed is in the name of the deceased owner, whose heir is standing in front of you with the legal documentation proving that," Jasper said. "Process the registration." There was a pause of about 3 seconds. "Yes, sir," the clerk said, and began filling out the form. Evelyn gathered her remaining papers with methodical precision. She did not look immediately at Jasper, and he understood that she was deciding something, deciding how she felt about what had just happened, deciding whether it was welcome or unwelcome, deciding whether it was condescending or simply practical. He waited. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady but not cold. There was something genuine underneath it, though I had not run out of arguments. "I could see that," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. "Jasper Trask," he said, and offered his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm. "Evelyn Harper." "Harper Homestead," he said. "East of town. You know it. I know most of the land east of town. Your father kept good fences." Something moved through her eyes at the mention of her father, a flash of grief that she controlled quickly, but not quickly enough for him not to see it. He noted that she controlled it rather than let it pass across her face unchecked, and he respected that without quite knowing why. "He did," she said simply. She picked up her satchel. He stood back slightly, giving her room, not with the exaggerated courtesy of a man performing manners for an audience, but with the simple awareness of a person who understood physical space and how it mattered. "You stepped aside when I came through the gate this morning," she said. She said it without preamble, as though she had been carrying the observation around for the past hour and had decided she might as well say it. "I did," he said. "Men don't generally do that, not here." "I know." She looked at him for a moment with those direct brown eyes, as though she were trying to determine whether he was performing something or simply being something. "Good day, Mr. Trask," she said finally, and walked out of the registration office with the ease of someone who had accomplished what she came to accomplish and was not inclined to linger. Jasper watched her go, and then he stood at the registration counter for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, which was not like him at all. The clerk said something about the next registration, and Jasper turned his attention back to the business he had come to conduct, and he told himself once again that this was the end of it. He rode back to the Double T that evening through a countryside going gold and copper in the late September light. The ranch was 2 miles north of Caldwell, spread across a shallow valley that caught the best of the morning sun, and he had known every inch of it for 15 years. He had built the main house himself, with help from his foreman, a quietly competent man named Elias Webb, and 2 hands who had been with him from almost the beginning. The house was not large, but it was solid, with a wide front porch and deep windows, and a kitchen that was bigger than kitchens in most ranch houses, because Jasper had believed, and continued to believe, that a good kitchen was not a luxury. He sat on the porch that evening, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and thought about the Harper homestead east of town. He thought about a woman standing at a registration counter with a probate filing from the Sumner County Courthouse, and a jaw set against the particular injustice of being told that what she legally owned did not belong to her, because the name on the original deed was a man's name. He thought about the way she had said, "I had not run out of arguments," and the way she had looked at him afterward, measuring him, trying to figure out what kind of man he was. He thought about the fact that she was running a homestead alone, apparently, and that a homestead required work that did not stop because the person doing it was grieving or overwhelmed, or trying to fight through the bureaucratic wall of a livestock registration clerk, who had never been required to think about inheritance law. He thought about none of this in particularly romantic terms, which was perhaps why it stayed with him. Elias Webb came out onto the porch in the evening and leaned against the rail with his own coffee, looking out at the darkening valley. "Good market?" Elias asked. "Bought 30 head, Jasper said. "Fair price." "Hear anything about the Harper place?" Jasper looked at him. "Old Robert Harper's daughter came into the market today," Elias continued, apparently unaware of anything significant in the question. "I heard in town he passed in the spring. Wonder if she'll keep the place or sell." "Keep it," Jasper said with a certainty that had no particular basis. Elias glanced at him. "You met her, briefly." Elias said nothing more, which was one of the things Jasper valued most about him. 3 days passed. On the 4th day, Jasper was riding the east fence line to check for breaks in the wire, which was routine maintenance that he still liked to do himself when time allowed, and the Harper property line came into view just beyond the tree line. He could see the house from the ridge, a modest structure with a well-kept yard and a small barn and a garden that had clearly been properly tended through the summer and was now being put to bed for the fall. There was a figure in the garden, moving in the particular bent-back way of someone pulling late-season plants, and even at this distance he recognized the set of those shoulders. He had not planned to stop. He stopped. He rode down the ridge at a pace that was slower than necessary and came to a halt at the fence line, and Evelyn Harper looked up from her garden with the expression of a person who has heard an unfamiliar horse and is assessing the situation before committing to a response. She shaded her eyes with one hand. "Mr. Trask," she said, when she had apparently determined that it was indeed him. "Miss Harper," he said, "I was checking my east fence. Your property lines up with mine beyond the tree line." She straightened and walked toward the fence between them, pulling a work glove from her right hand. "I know," she said. "I checked the surveys when I took over the deed. You rode the boundary." "I walked most of it," she said. "I don't have a second horse yet." He took that in. 1 horse, a homestead to manage late September, which meant winter preparation would need to begin in earnest within weeks. "Your north pasture fence has a break," he said. "About a 1/4 mile in from the road. I could see it from the ridge." She looked north as though she could see through the tree line and the rising land to the specific fence post he was describing. "I haven't gotten to the north pasture yet," she said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of the arithmetic of one person with too many tasks and not enough hours. "I could fix it," he said. She looked at him. If you wanted it fixed, he added. There was a pause in which she was clearly deciding something again. He had already learned in their 2 brief encounters that she did not make decisions carelessly, that there was always a beat of consideration before she committed. I won't have you fix my fence without compensation, she said finally. That's not a deal I'm comfortable with. I wasn't offering charity, he said. I was offering a trade. She tilted her head slightly. What kind of trade? I need to know this eastern range, he said. I've been planning to expand this direction for 2 years, but I don't know the land well enough yet. Your father knew it better than anyone. If you walked the eastern boundary with me and told me what you know about it, the water sources, the seasonal flooding, the good grazing land and the bad, that's worth a fence repair. It was not a false offer. It was true that he wanted to know the eastern range better. It was also true that the fence repair was not something he needed to make the offer about, that he could have done it without telling her and she might not have noticed for weeks. But he wanted to give her something she could accept on terms that felt equal, and this was the best way he could think to do it. She considered him for a long moment. You could just ask me about the land without fixing the fence, she said. I could, he agreed, but you want to fix the fence. Your cattle will drift north without it. I know that, she said, and the smallest trace of amusement crossed her face. All right, Mr. Trask, it's a fair trade. They set the day for Saturday, which was 2 days out. He rode back to the Double T, feeling something he had not felt in a long while, a kind of forward-leaning anticipation, the sensation of something beginning rather than the satisfaction of something completed, which was the feeling he was more accustomed to. Saturday arrived with a sky of extraordinary clarity, the kind of deep blue that only happened in Kansas in late September when the summer heat had finally stepped back and left the air clean and bright. Jasper arrived at the Harper property line with a horse-drawn wagon carrying fence posts, wire and tools, and found Evelyn already outside in her working clothes with a horse saddled and tied to the fence post nearest the barn. She had a rifle in the scabbard on the saddle, he noticed. Sensible. They fixed the fence first, which took most of the morning because the break turned out to be more significant than he had estimated from the ridge. 3 consecutive posts rotted through at the base. He dug while she measured and cut the new wire, and he noticed that she worked without commentary or instruction-seeking, simply observing what needed to be done and doing the next piece of it. When the 3rd post was set and the wire strung, she tested the tension herself, pressing it with both hands, checking the staples. Good, she said. It'll hold through winter, he said. They ate the midday meal she had packed sitting on the tailgate of his wagon, which felt natural in the way that shared outdoor meals sometimes do, just 2 people and food and a landscape going bright gold around them. How long have you had the Double T? She asked. 15 years, he said. Started with 40 acres and 12 cattle. And now, 420 acres and roughly 300 head, depending on the season. She was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic of that growth in her head. You built it yourself, she said. It was not quite a question. With good people, he said. Elias Webb, my foreman, has been with me 12 years. Couldn't do it without him. My father built this place himself too, she said. She was looking out at the property, and her voice had taken on the quality of someone choosing their words carefully around something tender. He came here in '68 when I was 12, bought the land with everything he had. There were years when everything he had was almost nothing. She paused. He died owing no one anything, and he'd paid down the mortgage entirely 3 years before the end. He was proud of that. He should have been, Jasper said. She looked at him. Most people would have something sympathetic and somewhat hollow to say about a man who died leaving so little. He left you a paid property, Jasper said. That's not little. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded once, as though he had passed some kind of quiet test. They rode the eastern range in the afternoon, and she knew the land the way people know land they have grown up on, with the intimate, almost unconscious knowledge of someone who has walked it in every season. She showed him the spring-fed stream that ran reliable water through August but ran thin in September. She showed him the low ground near the eastern tree line that flooded in April and should not be used for winter calving. She showed him the high northern pasture, which caught the wind badly but stayed dry when everything else was mud. He listened without interrupting, which she seemed to appreciate. The sun was dropping toward the western ridge when they turned back toward the Harper house, and Evelyn was talking about her plans for spring. She wanted to increase her herd, she said, but she needed to get through the winter first, and the winter required firewood and feed stores and roof repairs, and she was working through the list methodically. "You're doing this alone," he said. "Mostly," she said. "I've been hiring day labor for the heaviest work. It costs more than I'd like, but there's no other way around it." He thought about this. He thought about the market and the registration clerk and the broker who had not turned around, and he thought about the particular kind of exhaustion that came from having to fight for every inch of ground that should simply have been yours by right. "If you need extra hands for winter preparation," he said carefully, "the Double T typically has capacity in October. I could lend you 2 men for a week." She turned to look at him as they rode, and her expression was more complex this time. "That's generous," she said. "It's practical," he said. "A neighbor who makes it through winter is better for everyone than a neighbor who doesn't." "You don't need to dress it up as practicality," she said. "I can tell the difference between a business calculation and a kindness." He said nothing. "I'll accept it," she said, "and I'll return the labor in spring when I can. I'm a good hand with cattle." "I don't doubt it," he said. She smiled then fully for the first time, and it rearranged something in the landscape of his face that he had kept fairly still for a long time. He rode home in the blue-gray dusk thinking that he had not been wrong about her. She was going to keep the place, and she was going to make it work, and she was going to do it on her own terms, which were quite demanding terms by any measure. He thought about that smile for longer than was strictly necessary. October came in on a sharp northwest wind that reminded everyone in the county that Kansas was not interested in gentle transitions between seasons. The sky went from the brilliant clarity of late September to a kind of iron gray that sat low over everything, and the grass in the pastures lost its green and went the color of old straw. He sent Elias and a young hand named Cord over to the Harper place for a week, as he had offered, and Elias came back with a quiet assessment. "She runs a tight operation," Elias said. "Not much waste. She knows what she's doing." "The roof fixed," Elias said, "and the woodpile. And she had us rehang the barn doors because they were catching in the wind." He paused. "She worked right alongside us the whole time, Mr. Trask. Not watching. Working." Jasper nodded. "She's a fine woman," Elias said in the tone of a man who is conveying more information than the words themselves carry. Jasper looked at him. "I'm just saying," Elias said mildly, and went attend to the horses. Jasper found himself riding the east fence line with more regularity than strict maintenance required over the following weeks. Twice he stopped at the Harper place on the pretext of checking the repaired fence posts, and both times Evelyn was working somewhere on the property and came to speak with him at the fence line without appearing particularly surprised to see him. The third time he stopped, she brought coffee. She handed it up to him on his horse, in a tin cup, without comment, and he dismounted, and they stood at the fence and drank coffee in the cold October air, and talked about the cattle market and the winter outlook, and a dispute between 2 ranchers 3 miles north about water rights. And then they talked about other things. She had been educated in Chicago, she told him. Her mother's family was from there, and she had spent several years in the city before her mother passed and she came back to Kansas to help her father. She had not found the city as satisfying as she had expected. "Why not?" he asked. She thought about it. "Too many walls," she said finally. "Not just buildings. Everything in the city felt like it was behind something. You had to go through a door to get to what you actually wanted. Out here it's all just in front of you." He understood that entirely. "What about you?" she asked. "Where did you come from before this?" "Missouri," he said. "Small farm outside Joplin. Left when I was 19. "Why?" He considered the question with the same directness she had used. There wasn't enough, he said. Land, opportunity, room to do things the way I thought they should be done. I needed more space. She smiled again, that full-faced smile. And you found it. I did. There was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that only happens between people who have passed some invisible threshold of knowing each other, where silence doesn't require filling. I owe you a labor trade, she said. I haven't forgotten. Spring is soon enough, he said. I intend to honor it, she said. There was something firm underneath her voice, a quality he had come to recognize as her particular form of pride. Not the bristling, defensive pride of someone who felt looked down upon, but the clear, upright pride of someone who had decided what their word meant and intended to keep it so. I know you do, he said. He rode back to the Double T that day, feeling something warm in his chest that he spent the first mile trying to name, and then the second mile simply allowing to be there without a name, because some things did not benefit from too much analysis. November brought the first hard freeze, and with it, an incident that Jasper would not forget for the rest of his life, not because of anything dramatic about it, but because of how clearly it showed him something he had been moving toward without quite admitting it. He was at the Caldwell General Store picking up supplies when he overheard two men talking at the counter. He recognized one of them, a speculator named Halford Gaines, who had been circling the smaller homesteads east of town for the past 2 years, making low offers and then making them again, wearing people down with repetition. He had not tried the Double T because he was not a stupid man, and he knew the difference between a ranch that was going to sell and one that was not. Harper girl's going to be underwater by February, Gaines was saying to his companion, a thin man Jasper didn't recognize. She's got no credit line, no partner, no hired help worth speaking of. I give her 2 more months and she'll take whatever I offer. Something went very still in Jasper. You've been to see her? The thin man asked. October, Gaines said. She was polite but not interested. She will be. Jasper set down the sack of flour he had been holding and turned to look at Halford Gaines with an expression that a number of people in Caldwell had described over the years in various ways, all of which came down to the same thing. It was the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not going to be talked out of it. Gaines, he said. Gaines turned and the color in his face shifted slightly. Trask. The Harper homestead is sound, Jasper said. The roof is solid. The wood supply is set for winter. The cattle are in good condition. Miss Harper is a competent manager, and she will not be looking to sell in February. Gaines held his gaze for a moment and then apparently decided that whatever calculation he was running was not coming out in his favor. I wasn't. I know what you were doing, Jasper said. I'd leave it alone. He picked up his flour, collected the rest of his supplies, and rode out of Caldwell. He told himself he had said what he said because it was simply the truth, because he had ridden the East Range and seen the Harper place and knew its condition. He told himself it was not personal. He was, by this point, not entirely believing himself. He spent a week after that wrestling with the question of what exactly he was doing, what his frequent visits to the East Fence line were about, what the coffee conversation and the labor trade and the standing at fences in cold air were about. And then one morning in the second week of November, he got on his horse and rode to the Harper place directly, without the excuse of the fence line, and knocked on the front door. She opened it in her working clothes, which meant she had been up since early morning doing the things that a person running a small homestead alone had to do before the sun was fully up. Mr. Trask, she said, with an expression that conveyed both surprise and the particular alertness of someone trying to read the purpose of an unscheduled visit. I was wondering, he said, if you would have supper with me in town on Friday evening. He said it plainly, without preamble or circumlocution, because he had learned over 15 years that the most efficient and honest way to want something was to say clearly what you wanted. She looked at him for a long moment. Supper, she said. At the hotel dining room, he said. It's decent enough. I know the hotel dining room, she said. He waited. She tilted her head slightly. Is this a social invitation or a business one? Social, he said. Another pause. He understood that she was doing the same kind of calculation he had spent the previous week doing, weighing something, checking something against some internal measure. "All right," she said. "Friday." He rode home feeling something he had not felt in a long time, a kind of lightness, which was unfamiliar enough to be slightly disorienting. Friday came. He wore his good coat, the dark wool one that he kept for occasions that required something more than work clothes, and he rode into Caldwell in the early evening, with the stars just beginning to come out over a sky that had gone a deep, velvety blue. She was already in front of the hotel when he arrived, which he noted with a kind of appreciation. She was wearing a dark green dress that was simpler than what most women wore to town dinners but suited her precisely, and her hair was pinned up but with less severity than her working style, a few dark auburn strands loose around her face, and she looked, in the light from the hotel windows, like someone he wanted to look at for a very long time. He tied his horse, stepped up to the boardwalk and offered his arm. She took it. They ate at a corner table, and the meal itself was less important than the conversation, which went from the county water rights dispute to the Chicago Exposition of 1893, which was still a decade away, but which she had read about in a periodical and found fascinating, to the question of whether Kansas would remain good cattle country through the end of the century as grazing pressure increased, to the particular books they had each read most recently. She had been reading a collection of essays on land management, and he had been working through a history of the cattle drives, and somehow from there they arrived at the question of what a person owed the land they worked, which was a question that Jasper felt strongly about, and which she apparently felt even more strongly about than him. "My father used to say the land doesn't belong to you," she said, her hands around her coffee cup. "You're just the current steward of it. You're responsible for handing it on in better condition than you received it." "I believe that," he said. "Most ranchers don't," she said. "Most ranchers will run the land until it's spent and then move on." "Some do," he said. "I've watched it." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to run sheep on the north pasture in the spring," she said, as though this was a confession of something. He raised an eyebrow. "I know," she said. "Cattle country, sheep men get run out of counties for less. But the north pasture won't support cattle and the grass management is different with sheep. They'll actually improve the soil composition if it's done right." "I've read about that," he said. She looked at him with something between wariness and cautious hope. "You're not going to tell me it's a bad idea?" "It might be a complicated idea," he said. "There are men in this county who take the cattle-sheep divide personally." "I know. But it's your land," he said, "and if the agronomy is right, it's a sound decision." She looked at him steadily. "You're a harder man to argue with than I expected," she said. "Why did you expect to argue with me?" "Because you're Jasper Trask," she said, and smiled slightly. "And Jasper Trask is the most feared man at the cattle market. That implies a certain set of opinions about how things should be done." He leaned back in his chair slightly. "Being feared at the market is about cattle pricing and not accepting bad deals," he said. "It's got nothing to do with what a neighbor does with her north pasture." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark brown eyes, and then she said quietly, "You stepped aside for me when I came through the gate." "I did," he said. "And you've stepped aside for me in every conversation we've had since," she said. "You give me room." He thought about that. "Is that unusual?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "In my experience," she said, "yes." There was a quality to the silence that followed that was different from previous silences between them. It had weight to it. It had the weight of two people who were standing at the edge of something and both knew it and were deciding together whether to step forward. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "Supper, conversation." "I'd like that too," she said. They rode out of Caldwell separately, as was appropriate, but he stayed in her sight until her turnoff, and she lifted a hand as she went, and he watched until the darkness took her, and then he rode home to the Double T feeling as though the world had rearranged itself slightly in a way that suited him better than before. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that he had not had in his life for a long time. Friday suppers became a regular thing, And between the Friday suppers, there were afternoons at the fence line, and shared rides across the eastern range, and one Saturday, when she came to the Double T to see the cattle operation, and he walked her through everything with the same transparency he would have shown a business partner, which he had the slowly clarifying sense she might eventually become, though in a different configuration than he was used to thinking about business partnerships. Elias watched all of this with an expression of benign satisfaction that Jasper chose not to acknowledge directly. December came in cold and clear, the nights dropping below freezing and the days staying bright and sharp. He helped her through a difficult calving that came 2 weeks early on a Sunday morning when the temperature was in the 20s, and they worked in the barn together for 4 hours in the lamplight while the calf found its footing. And somewhere in the middle of all that, with straw on her coat and lamplight on her face, he understood that what he felt was not passing interest or the attraction of proximity or the simple warmth of having a capable neighbor. He was in love with her. The recognition of it was not dramatic, not a sudden thunderclap, but quiet and certain in the way that the most important things were usually quiet and certain, the way you knew a piece of land was right before you could fully articulate why. He said nothing about this on that Sunday. He was not the kind of man who said things before they were ready to be said. But on the next Friday evening, at their usual corner table in the hotel dining room, something in the dynamic between them had shifted, as though the clarification of his own feelings had made everything slightly more visible, slightly more vivid. She felt it too, he could tell. There was a quality of attention in her that had changed, a way she turned to look at him when he spoke that was different from a month ago. After supper, they stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel in the cold December air, their breath visible, the town quiet around them at this hour, and he said, "Evelyn." She looked at him. "I think you know what I want to say," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I might," she said. "I don't want to say it in a way that puts pressure on something that is working as it is," he said. "If you need more time, I understand that." She looked at him with a steadiness that was one of her defining qualities. "My father died in April," she said. "I came back to property I had to fight to register in my own name, and I have spent 8 months wondering whether I could actually do this, whether I could make it work, whether I wanted to make it work alone, and I have been so busy answering those questions that I haven't given myself much room for anything else." "I know," he said, "but I've been noticing something," she said. "Every time you ride up to the fence line, I'm glad. And every Friday when I ride into town, I'm not just looking forward to supper." She paused. "I notice when you step aside for me, not just at the market, in every conversation. You give me room and you pay attention, and you don't try to do things for me that I can do myself, and then you do the things I actually need help with without making it into something I have to be grateful for." She looked at him directly. "That's unusual, Jasper." He had not been prepared for how much his own name and her voice would affect him. "I know it is," he said. She stepped forward slightly, which reduced the distance between them from appropriate for strangers to something different. "Say what you want to say," she said. "I love you," he said, simply, directly, the way he did most things. She looked at him for a moment that felt long, and then she said, "I know. And I believe I love you back. Though I want you to understand that I am not going to say that lightly, and I'm not going to stop being who I am on account of it." "I would not want you to," he said. She smiled, the full smile, and reached up and touched his face with her gloved hand, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood like that in the cold December night outside the hotel, and it was one of the finest moments of his life. They were married in March of 1883. The wedding was in the Caldwell Presbyterian Church on a Saturday afternoon, when the first tentative green was showing at the edges of the fields, and the air smelled like turned earth and promise. It was not a large wedding because neither of them wanted a large wedding, but it was a proper one, with Elias Webb standing for Jasper and a woman named Clara Dietz, who had been Evelyn's closest friend from her childhood years in Kansas, standing for Evelyn. The Reverend, a tall and somewhat formal man named Mr. Alcott, which was not the Mr. Alcott of the registration office but his uncle, read the vows in a steady voice, and Jasper and Evelyn said them to each other, looking at each other's faces the way you look at something you do not intend to ever stop looking at. Afterward there was a meal at the hotel dining room and dancing in the street, because someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a guitar, and the day was fine enough for it. And Jasper, who was not known for dancing, danced with his wife twice and watched her dance with Elia's and with Clara's husband and with several other people, and the pleasure of watching her be happy in a crowd of people who were happy for her was as good as anything he could remember feeling. They rode home to the Double T together in the late afternoon, and Evelyn stood on the porch of the main house looking out at the valley going golden in the sunset and said, "I want to keep the Harper place." "I know," he said. "It's mine," she said. "I want to run it separately as part of our operation but with its own books." "That's sensible," he said. "The acreage gives us more flexibility." She looked at him. "You've already thought about this." "I've been thinking about it since October," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, full-bodied, and turned to him and took his lapels in both hands and looked at him squarely. "Jasper Trask," she said, "you are a genuinely unusual man." "I've been told that," he said. "I mean it as a compliment," she said. "I know you do," he said, and put his arms around her, and they stood on the porch of the house that he had built watching the sun go down over their valley. Spring arrived with the energy of a thing that had been held back all winter and was now releasing itself with full force. The eastern range went from brown to green in a period of days that seemed almost too fast to be real, and the cattle were restless with the new grass and the longer days, and there was work enough for everyone from first light to last. Evelyn moved into the Double T, but she rode to the Harper place every other day to manage it, sometimes alone and sometimes with Cord, who had taken on a kind of informal role as the primary hand for the eastern operation. She had 12 cattle of her own, and she was buying more carefully, selecting for quality rather than quantity, which was the same philosophy Jasper had used in the early years of the Double T. She put her sheep on the north pasture in April. He had warned her that there might be comment about it, and there was, but less than either of them expected, because the word had apparently gone around Caldwell by some informal mechanism that the north pasture sheep were a Harper decision made on Harper land, and that Jasper Trask had not objected to them. And the men who might otherwise have made an issue of it seemed to conclude that objecting to something Jasper Trask had not objected to was a calculation that did not come out in their favor. Halford Gaines came by the Double T one afternoon in May. Jasper came out onto the porch to meet him, and Evelyn came and stood beside him, which she did without being asked and without any air of theater, simply standing where she wanted to stand. Gaines took off his hat. "Mr. Trask, Mrs. Trask." "Gaines," Jasper said. "I wanted to say congratulations on the marriage," Gaines said. He was being careful, which Jasper could see clearly. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Her voice was entirely pleasant. "And I wanted to say that if the Harper place ever comes up for discussion, I'd be a willing buyer." He glanced at Evelyn. "No offense meant, Mrs. Trask, just putting it on the table." "The Harper place is not going to come up for discussion," Evelyn said with complete equanimity, "but I appreciate you making the drive out to tell us personally." Gaines nodded, put his hat back on, and rode out. Evelyn watched him go with an expression that was entirely composed and then said, "He'll be back." "Probably," Jasper said. "It won't matter," she said, and went back inside to finish whatever she had been doing, and Jasper stood on the porch for a moment feeling a profound and uncomplicated happiness. Summer came in with full heat and the work went up accordingly. They fell into a rhythm that suited both of them. A pattern of days that was demanding and full and occasionally exhausting, and always meaningful. They worked the same land and ate at the same table and argued sometimes about grazing plans and fence placements, and whether the south pasture needed to be rested this year. And the arguments had the quality of arguments between people who respect each other, which meant they were short and productive, and usually ended with one of them being right, and the other one acknowledging it without drama. She was right more often than she was wrong, which he found he respected without any difficulty, because being married to someone who was often right was a practical asset, not a challenge to his sense of himself. There was an evening in July when they sat on the porch after supper watching a thunderstorm come in from the west, the lightning walking across the plains toward them in slow, enormous steps, and she said, "I'm going to have a baby." He turned to look at her. She was watching the lightning, her hands in her lap, and she glanced at him with an expression that contained a complicated mixture of things, joy and apprehension, and something deep and tender. He reached over and took her hand. "When?" he said. "February," she said. He thought about February, cold and hard and far away, and he thought about all the things that needed to be done between now and then he thought about something entirely different, something that was not logistical at all, something that was simply the feeling of a man who has been given something he did not fully know he wanted until the moment he was given it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm strong and healthy, and I intend to remain so." "I know you are," he said. "I wasn't questioning it." She squeezed his hand. "I know you weren't." The lightning came closer, and they stayed on the porch watching it, his hand over hers, until the first rain arrived and drove them inside. He told Elias the next morning, and Elias took off his hat and held it in front of him with both hands and said, "That's the finest news I've heard in years, Mr. Trask," with a warmth so genuine that it was almost startling, and then put his hat back on and went to work. The rest of the summer and through the fall, Evelyn continued doing what she always did, which was everything, and she did it with the same efficiency and without complaint, though she modified some of the heavier work as the months went on, sensibly and without being asked. He did not hover over her, because he had learned that hovering over Evelyn Harper, now Evelyn Trask, was one of the faster ways to discover that she had a pointed opinion about people who assumed she needed hovering over. He was, however, attentive. He rode to the Harper place himself on the days she went, and he made sure the water supply was always set, and the woodpile never dropped too low, and the evening meal was always taken care of, either by his own effort or by the simple arrangement of kitchen supplies that made it easy. He did these things without commentary or self-congratulation, the way he fixed fences, because they needed doing and he could do them, and that was the whole of the matter. She noticed all of it. She had always noticed things. "You're very good at this," she said one evening in October, watching him come in from the woodpile. "At carrying wood," he said. "At caring for people without making them feel cared for in a diminishing way," she said. He set the wood down and looked at her. "Most men who are kind about it are kind in a way that reminds you that they're being kind," she said. "Like they need to be seen doing it. You just do it. The wood needs to come in," he said. "That's all." She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on his chest and looked up at him. "I love you, Jasper." He covered her hands with his. "I love you," he said. November passed, and December came with the kind of cold that settled into the bones of the plains and stayed there, and they were ready for it. The winter preparations had been thorough, and the house was warm, and the cattle were in good shape, and the Harper Place's cattle were in equally good shape under Cord's winter management. January was cold and quiet and long, and Evelyn read more than she usually did, and they played cards some evenings and talked about the future in the easy, concrete way of people who are genuinely planning something together rather than just describing wishes. She wanted to expand the sheep operation on the North Pasture, she said. She had been corresponding with a woman in Colorado Territory who ran a successful sheep and cattle mixed operation and had some practical advice about bloodlines and grazing rotation. He was reading about irrigation, the possibility of diverting more water from the spring-fed stream to support an additional hay field that could supply both properties through hard winters. They talked about the child. She wanted a boy first, she said, which made him smile because most people assumed women always wanted girls. "Why a boy?" he asked. "Because boys can be whoever they want in this country," she said. "I want to raise one who understands that girls can be too." He looked at her steadily. "You're going to be an extraordinary mother," he said. She looked faintly surprised, as though this was not quite what she had expected him to say, and then something soft moved through her expression. "I hope so," she said. On the 14th of February, 1884, which was a day that Jasper would note with some amusement was Valentine's Day, their son was born. The birth was attended by the local doctor, a steady-handed woman named Dr. Colleen Marsh, who had been practicing in Sumner County for 6 years, and who had the respect of most of the county and the resistance of a few who still found a female physician difficult to accept, which Dr. Marsh addressed by being consistently better than the alternative and not spending much time worrying about those few. The boy was born in the early morning hours, healthy and loud, with a substantial quantity of dark hair and the general air of someone who had arrived with things to do. They named him Robert James Trask. Robert for her father, James for a brother of Jasper's who had died young. Jasper held his son for the first time while the sky outside was lightening from black to the deep blue of early morning, and he sat in the chair beside the bed where Evelyn was resting with her eyes half open and her face worn but profoundly settled, and he held Robert James Trask and understood that this was the center of everything. "He has your expression," Evelyn said, her voice soft with exhaustion. "What expression?" "The one where you're deciding something," she said. He looked at his son's face, the small furrowed brow, the intent and somewhat affronted quality of a newborn confronting the world. "Maybe," he said. "He's going to be a handful," she said. "Good," he said. She smiled and closed her eyes, and he sat with his son in the early morning light, and the valley outside was just beginning to show itself. The fields and fences, and the distant line of the eastern tree line, all of it belonging to them and being worked by them, and being built into something that would last. Spring of 1884 was one of the finest on record in Sumner County, which everyone agreed on, and which Jasper and Evelyn had particular reason to appreciate, because it meant that the expanded hay field was off to a strong start, and the sheep on the north pasture had lambed well, and the combined cattle herd was in excellent condition. Robert James Trask spent the spring in a cloth carrier on his mother's back, while she rode the shorter distances on the property, which was not entirely conventional, but which Evelyn had decided was the most practical arrangement, and which the baby seemed to consider perfectly acceptable. He was a good-tempered child who observed everything with an expression of serious interest, a quality he had from both parents, and who had learned very early that the world was large, and that it moved and smelled of grass and horses and wood smoke, and was generally interesting. Jasper took him to the barn when the boy was 4 months old and held him up to see the cattle over the fence rail, and Robert James studied the nearest cow with an expression of concentrated thought that made Elias, who was watching from across the yard, laugh out loud. "He's evaluating the cattle," Evelyn said from behind them. "Good instincts," Jasper said. The Caldwell Cattle Market held its fall season in September of 1884, and Evelyn attended it for the first time since the previous year. She had cattle to register from the Harper operation, and she wanted to assess the market for a potential purchase in the spring, and she went with the same leather satchel and the same felt hat and the same sheaf of papers she had carried through that gate 2 years before. Jasper was already in the market when she arrived. He was standing near the pen of Hereford cattle in conversation with 2 buyers, and when he saw her come through the gate he did not break off the conversation or make any signal or gesture that would draw attention. He simply stepped aside. He had not thought about it. It was simply what he did. She walked through the space he made, and she saw him see her, and she gave him the smallest nod, and something passed between them that had the quality of an entire conversation compressed into a gesture. She went to the registration desk. The clerk this year was a different man, older and less easily confused, and the registration was processed in 5 minutes without difficulty. Jasper concluded his conversation with the buyers and found her in the crowd 20 minutes later near the water trough, making notes on her papers. "Good turnout today," she said when he came up beside her. "Strong market," he said. "Prices are up." "I saw Halford Gaines by the East Gate," she said. "He's been buying north of here," Jasper said. "He's not a factor for us anymore." "I know," she said. "I just like keeping track of him." "Prudent," he said. She looked up from her papers with that look she had, the one that combined assessment and affection in proportions that had not stopped being affecting after 2 years of being the object of it. "Are you available for lunch?" she said. "I am," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to her notes. He stood beside her in the middle of the market, in the noise and smell and motion of it, and thought about the fact that 2 years ago he had stepped aside at this gate for a woman he had never met, and the whole of his life had pivoted on that moment in a way that still seemed almost too elegant to be accidental, though he was not a man given to mystical thinking. He had simply moved, and she had noticed, and here they were. 3 years passed the way good years pass, when you are too busy living them to count them carefully. The double T grew, gradually but steadily, adding acreage to the east when the opportunity arose and deepening the quality of the herd, rather than simply expanding its size. The Harper operation, which they kept under Evelyn's name in the registry as a matter of principle that Jasper fully supported, developed its sheep side into something that had become, by 1887, one of the more successful mixed operations in the county. Noticed favorably in the county agricultural report, and cited once in a farming periodical from Kansas City, that Evelyn read with an expression of complete equanimity, and then folded and put in the drawer where she kept things she was pleased about. Robert James Trask was 3 years old by the summer of 1887, which meant he was old enough to be comprehensively into everything and opinionated about most of it. He had his mother's directness and his father's stillness, and a curiosity that was entirely his own, and he was happiest on a horse, or in the barn, or following Elias around the yard asking questions that Elias answered with inexhaustible patience. In the spring of 1887, Evelyn told Jasper she was expecting again, and this time the expression on her face when she told him had more joy in it and less apprehension, because the first time had gone well and she was settled in herself in a way that was deeper than it had been 3 years ago. "When?" he said. "November," she said. He thought about November. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, and they stood in the kitchen of the main house, while the early morning light came through the deep windows and Robert James could be heard outside already engaged in some conversation with the chickens that required a great deal of vocalization on his part. "2 children," he said. "Don't sound so surprised," she said, her voice amused against his chest. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm pleased." "So am I," she said. They stood there for a moment longer, and then the chickens apparently became more urgent and Robert James came to the back door and said, "Papa, Blackie won't eat the corn," with an air of personal offense, and Jasper went outside to address the chicken situation, and Evelyn stood at the kitchen window watching them, and her face in that moment had the quality of a thing that had come fully into itself, settled and bright and entirely at peace. Their daughter was born in November of 1887, on a night when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside, soft and quiet, covering the valley and the fields and the eastern tree line in something that made everything look new. They named her Clara Rose Trask, after Evelyn's friend Clara Dietz, who was moved to tears when she was told, and for the rose that had come up wild along the south fence of the Harper place every June, which Evelyn had never pulled even though it had no practical purpose, simply because it was beautiful. Clara Rose was a different sort of baby than Robert James, quieter and more contemplative, with large dark eyes that looked at everything with a patient, considering expression. Robert James regarded her with the complex ambivalence of a 3-year-old encountering a competitor. And then, within 2 weeks, with a proprietary affection that manifested as narrating everything in her vicinity, which seemed to be his way of ensuring she knew about the world. Elias, holding Clara Rose for the first time, said, "She's going to run this place someday," with complete conviction, and Evelyn said, "She can run whatever she wants," which was the end of that conversation. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was hard, one of the hardest in recent memory, and the snow that had fallen on Clara Rose's birth night had been the beginning of a pattern that did not relent until March. They were prepared for it, better prepared than most because of the hay stores and the repaired structures and the extra supplies they had put by in October, and they came through it without the catastrophic losses that hit some of the neighboring operations. 2 ranches east of the tree line sold that spring, their owners having decided that one more hard winter was beyond what they wanted to face. Jasper bought some of the acreage from one of them, a reasonable transaction at a fair price, and the expansion made the Double T the largest operation in this part of Sumner County, which was a fact that Jasper noted without particular pride, because he had learned that size without quality was just size. He told Evelyn this on the evening the sale was finalized. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you turn down the acreage that wasn't right for 20 years. "Not quite 20 years, he said. "Close enough," she said. They were on the porch, as they often were in the evenings, with the children asleep inside and the valley dark and full of stars and the sound of the cattle settled and the land at rest around them. "Are you happy?" she asked. He turned to look at her. "I ask because I want to know," she said, "not because I'm worried." He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about 15 years of building a ranch from 40 acres and 12 cattle. He thought about the cattle market, and a woman walking through a gate with a leather satchel and a felt hat and papers in her hand. He thought about coffee at a fence line in cold October air, and suppers at a corner table in the hotel dining room, and a Sunday morning in a barn with a lamp and a new calf and straw on her coat. He thought about their son asking about chickens and their daughter's dark eyes and the snow falling on the night she was born and the valley outside right now, dark and quiet and entirely theirs. "Yes," he said, "completely." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the way that people sit who have built something together that is large enough and solid enough to be sat with in silence. "I noticed something a long time ago," she said. "What?" "That when you stepped aside for me at the gate that first morning," she said, "you didn't even think about it, you just did it." "No," he said, "I didn't think about it. I'd had a morning of people not moving," she said. "The broker who wouldn't turn around, the clerk at the registration desk, and then there was you, the most feared man in the yard, and you just stepped aside." "I've thought about that," he said. "What did you think?" "I thought that stepping aside and being afraid of someone are 2 separate things," he said. "Men step aside because they're afraid of me. I stepped aside because I wanted to." She lifted her head from his shoulder to look at him. "Because you wanted to," she said. "Because you walked in like you were exactly where you should be," he said, "and I didn't see any reason to be in your way." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she pressed her lips briefly, gently to his cheek and settled her head back on his shoulder. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and then they checked on the children. Robert James sprawled across his bed with the absolute commitment of a sleeping child. Clara rose in her cradle with her hands curled under her chin, and they went to their room and closed the door on the cold night. In the years that followed, the Double T became what Jasper had always intended it to be. Not just a cattle operation, but a working farm of the kind that could sustain itself through bad years and grow in good ones. The Harper operation's sheep side continued to expand, and by 1890, it was supplying wool to 2 textile buyers in Kansas City, a development that Evelyn had worked toward methodically, and that was providing a secondary income stream that proved its value when the cattle market had a weak year in 1891. Robert James, by the time he was 7, could ride a horse competently, and was beginning to learn cattle work in the manner of ranch children, by watching and helping and being trusted with small tasks that grew as his skill did. He had his father's gift for patience and his mother's gift for observation, and he had the additional quality of being very good at getting along with everyone, which made him effective in ways that pure skill alone would not have. Clara Rose, at 4, was the kind of child who watched everything carefully, and then suddenly did it perfectly on her first real attempt, which made teaching her simultaneously easy and unsettling. She was already fascinated by the sheep in a way that had clearly absorbed several of her mother's traits around the North Pasture operation, and she had opinions about which lambs were the best candidates for the breeding program that she expressed with complete confidence despite being 4 years old. Evelyn watched her children becoming themselves and was happy in the way that people are happy when the thing they have built is taking on a life of its own, when the work of years starts to walk and talk and look at you with its own eyes. Jasper watched his children and his wife and his land and was happy in a quieter way, the way still water is happy, which is to say profound and without agitation, reflecting everything clearly. Elias Webb married a widow from the north part of the county in 1889 and built a small house on the Double T property, which was Jasper's offer and which Elias accepted after 6 months of insisting it was too generous, and which suited everyone because Elias was as much a part of the ranch as any fence or field, and it made sense for him to be rooted there. Cord, the young hand who had more or less grown up on the Double T, had grown into a skilled cattleman and was now managing the Harper operation's daily work with the kind of quiet competence that made it run smoothly without requiring constant oversight. Halford Gaines had moved his operations north, out of Sumner County, and had not been a presence in several years. The cattle market in Caldwell had changed some, as markets do, but it was still the center of commerce for the region, and Jasper still went to it regularly and was still the kind of man that others watched enter. The difference was that now he was often accompanied by Evelyn, who had built her own presence at the market over the years, not the feared man kind of presence but something more interesting, the presence of someone who was known to know what she was talking about and who could not be easily dismissed or circumvented, partly because she had demonstrated this repeatedly, and partly because her husband was who he was, though she had made it clear, early and consistently, that she intended to stand on her own ground. He had never tried to take that ground from her. It was one of the foundations of everything. In the fall of 1892, Evelyn was 36 and Jasper was 44, and the Double T and the Harper operation together represented one of the most stable ranching properties in Sumner County. Not the largest, because some of the great cattle baronies dwarfed everything in their scale, but among the most consistently productive and the least indebted and the best managed by the honest assessment of anyone who looked at it. They were sitting at the registration desk of the Caldwell cattle market on a September morning that was identical in character to the September morning 10 years before, the sun hammering down and the smell of livestock and sawdust and fresh earth hanging over everything. And Evelyn was registering a purchase of breeding stock for the Harper operation while Jasper stood slightly behind and to her left, not hovering, simply present. And the clerk was this year a competent young woman who had been hired the previous spring and who processed the registration without difficulty and with notable efficiency. "Mrs. Trask," the clerk said, handing back the papers. "All registered." "Thank you," Evelyn said, and gathered her papers into her satchel. They walked out of the registration office and into the yard, and the market moved around them the way it always did, noise and motion and the particular energy of a place where large amounts of money were changing hands, and Jasper stepped slightly ahead to make space through a dense cluster of men near the water trough. She came through behind him and she touched his arm briefly as she passed. "Still doing that," she said. "Always," he said. They walked through the market together, her shoulder occasionally near his arm, talking about the animals they had come to see, and the prices they had observed, and what they thought the spring would look like based on what they were seeing. And around them the market went on with its business, and men stepped aside for Jasper Trask as they always had, and some of them stepped aside for Evelyn Trask too, because she had been coming here for 10 years, and she had built a thing that commanded its own kind of respect. In the evening they rode home through the Kansas countryside, the same countryside she had ridden 11 miles into on that Tuesday morning in 1882, though she knew it differently now. Every creek and ridge and fence line, every change of light through the seasons, everything that the land said if you listened carefully enough. The children were home when they arrived. Robert James was helping Cord with the late afternoon feeding, and Clara Rose was at the fence of the north pasture watching the sheep with an expression of concentrated assessment, and Elias came out of the barn and lifted a hand in greeting, and the house was warm and lit against the coming dark. Evelyn dismounted at the gate and stood for a moment looking at all of it, the valley and the fences and the barn and the house and the children and the lamplight in the windows, and Jasper came up beside her. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and it was 10 years since she had walked through a gate and he had stepped aside, and in those 10 years they had built a life together that was solid and good and deeply theirs, and neither of them needed to say any of this because they both knew it. She took his hand. He held it. They walked together through the gate and up to the house, and Robert James called out from the barn that the big roan heifer had a new calf, and Clara Rose came running from the pasture with the news about the ewe she had been watching for a week, who had finally produced a healthy lamb. And the kitchen was warm, and the table was set, and the valley was going dark around the house as the stars came out over the Kansas plain, and everything that needed to be was in its right place. The years, the good years that followed, brought new seasons and new calves and new lambs, and the steady accumulation of days that were not dramatic, not historic, not anything that anyone would write down, but that were the actual substance of a life, the daily evidence of something true and lasting, and built with both hands by two people who had the sense to recognize each other when they met. And it had all started, as the best things often did, with a single unremarkable gesture in a noisy cattle yard on a September morning, one man stepping aside, one woman noticing that he had, and both of them being wise enough to see what that meant.